First of all, to welcome Michael, whom we have known for quite some time, ever since we got in touch, particularly during the COVID times. And not only that, we knew him before that as a filmmaker. We've seen lovely films like, for example, The Challenge of Change and the ones that were made with Evelyn Blau, uh, Beyond Myth and Tradition. So he's somebody who's been a filmmaker, a film director, a script writer, an author, and educator is something. If you visit Michael's website, you will find the exceptional work he's been doing as an educator. And to add to that, he's got this beautiful array of interviews and interactions with people like Krishnamurti, Rinpoche, so many others. So all of that together, make for an enormous contribution, from him to life in general, because there is so much to talk to him about. And one book, something you will all be interested in. We have a copy in our library. It's called Unconditionally Free. It's huge, beautifully produced book. You can call it an extravaganza, actually. This production is so beautiful, actually. In a sense, it captures Krishnamurti's life and insights as nobody has done. I don't think I've seen something like it before. So, I mean, I just mentioned this to say how delighted we are to have Michael with us today. And along with Michael, so many people who have joined us today, and many of whom we don't know. Actually, it's just such a nice thing that internet helps us to communicate with everybody and say that everybody is welcome. So we have people from across the world. We have Yuga from Japan. We have Ricardo from Brazil. We have Stuart from Thailand. And we have so many people, of course, from India. So just to tell you a little bit about today's program, we called it as Flowering of Goodness, which is what Michael had said. So Michael will be speaking to us for about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 45 minutes. So it depends on the comfort zone. Once he's through with his agenda of things that he wants to communicate, then there will be an interesting time when all of us can actually talk to Michael. It's a unique opportunity. So before I pass on to Michael, I just want to pass on to Prabir Banerjee. Now, Prabir Banerjee is somebody also in our Kolkata center, is somebody who's quite incredible. Every center seems to have somebody whose passion has been to actually go through the teachings, try to go beyond them also. Prabir, over to
Uh,
you.
yeah, good morning, friends. Good morning, Michael. His works, whatever his films, his books, all these things, his works focus primarily on documentaries exploring human development, how we become what we are, and what prevents humanity from actualizing its true potential. Themes that include parenting, education, and culture. Michael was in touch with JK and also in touch with the great physicist David Bohm. He had 50 years of deep involvement with JK and David Bohm and their collaborative insights. Michael is going to share his feelings and views on the possibility of flowering of goodness in one's life and daily living, especially in the time of exponential use and growth of technology, artificial digital intelligence. Michael, please come. This is your show.
Yeah, I have to say that I'm humbled by your accolades. I'm certainly appreciative. Um, I came in my youth. I was in my mid-20s when I first came to Ojai and heard that Krishnaji was alive, and drove from Los Angeles, where I was living, to Ojai, sat in the audience, just came by myself. The next year I came again, and I realized that they had set up some video cameras, and I had heard that Kay didn't particularly like to be recorded, but the foundation felt that it was important that, he wasn't going to live forever, and that they needed to really do a good job of recording his last years or decade. So I was at the right time at the right place that year, and I offered my services. And Evelyn Blau and I became friends and colleagues, and now it's 50 years later, and I'm still editing and working with the material. So it really came as I really came as a journalist. That's the documentary field. Um, so 50 years is a long time, to be swimming or studying or recording or editing. If any of you have been involved with the film process, editing is a very precise process. So you go over the scenes over and over again, and you repeat it many times. So for 50 years, I've been editing K in one form or another. So all of that works on me, right? As I sit and work on the material is working on me. So it's been a very unique form of study or experience or really delving into it. And then, as they said, I traveled with him all around the world and recorded and had lunch with him. And, I was never familiar. I never considered him a friend per se. He was always open and available, but I respected his attention. So I never hammered him or questioned him about, well, what do you think about this or what do you think about that? Everybody else was coming with various problems and questions and needs, and I didn't want to join that pool. So I was always somewhat sitting on the fence, really, right? Almost as a voyeur, watching, what everybody else was doing, but had access, which was quite unique. And anyway, 100 interviews with people around the world. There's a couple of books. As was mentioned, Samdhong Rinpoche is a very important person in both K's history and also for us. Samdong is the only person in the world with the history and training and he's a professor, knows Sanskrit and has studied deeply all of these things. He's the Dalai Lama's right-hand guy. He was trained by the same teachers, and they've been together for their whole lives. He is the only person that, with that training, that met with Kay personally over many years at the Rajghat location. The Rajghat is located on the juncture of a river that comes from Sarnath, where Buddha gave his first talk, called the Buddha's Path. And then so you walk down that path, and then you make a right, and you're in Varanasi. So Kay, he would come with one or two of his friends, meaning Rinpoche would come and meet with Kay regularly. So in 1987, we were in Sarnath and interviewed him for the first time. Then in 2008, he came to California and was invited to the University of Santa Barbara. And I made a request to meet him and interview him, and he agreed. So we did our second interview many years later. Then, as a trustee of the KFA, we met in Brockwood, and we spent a week together. And I interviewed him several times there. And people who reviewed some of the notes commented that the dialogues were so rare that people at Rinpoche's level don't don't speak quite as easily or friendly or have access. You don't have access to these people, so they were really impressed with the nature of the conversations, and encouraged me to publish the material as a book. So we reached out to Rinpoche, and he agreed reluctantly, but he did agree. And I traveled to Dar es Salaam and met with him for over a week at his home. And so that's over 15 hours of recordings with this rare guy in Krishnaji's life. And that was published under the title Always Awakening. So, as was said, all of these various experiences have combined to give me a particular perspective, which will that's the basis of some of my observations. The first theme that was we talked about was the flowering of goodness. This was a phrase that Kay used not frequently, but particularly in dialogue with Alan Anderson back in the late 70s. And you may be familiar with the Anderson series. There were 18 one-hour interviews. They're really quite wonderful. Alan was a great sounding board for Kay to help him translate his messages to everybody. And he used the flowering of goodness in one of those conversations. And when I brought it up, the flowering of goodness is obviously what the intention of his whole collected works. The goal is for our innate goodness to flower. It's as simple as that. But the problem comes in when we try to flower goodness. There's a challenge, there's a problem when we try to again use a method, or when you try to flower goodness, you've already put it back into what the Buddhists would call grasping. Kay would use the word becoming. It's no longer choiceless awareness. It becomes a goal. Obviously, that means that there are mental processes involved, such as the ego, such as our desire to become better, et cetera, et cetera. So we can't actually set the flowering of goodness as the goal. It can be, Kay can say that that's what it is, but for us personally, we can't chase the flowering of goodness as our becomes our method. It becomes another tradition. And Kay's famous talk in Oman in 1929, when he said truth is a pathless land. You can't so the flowering of goodness is just another pathless land, or excuse me, is just another path if we set it up as a goal. So there's some paradox implicit in all of Kay's work, because he's using the cognitive, he's using language to describe something that language model, that whole frame of mind can't capture, can't grasp, can't hold on to. So the very studying of Kay's work actually implies that you're not living the teachings. You're not actually doing what he's asking us to do. Now, there's 250,000 pages of Kay's so-called teachings, his dialogues, his collected legacy. That's a huge volume of material for people to slug through. And yet, I don't think that he wants us to study all of his stuff. That's not what he wanted you to do. I think what he wanted you to do was to see and experience for yourself, in yourself, what he's pointing to. And then you have what they would call, he and David would call, an insight. You would have an insight, which is an aha, oh, I see it, I understand, and you would be done. You wouldn't go back. You wouldn't need to go back and turn another page and watch another video and spend 50 years, in my case, so-called studying the teachings. I have a little excuse because I came as a professional. It's my profession to go through all this stuff and make these programs and do what I want to do. But in the process, this challenge of people spending their whole life studying the teachings, I don't think that's what he had in mind. I don't think that was what it was about at all. And in one of the interviews that I did in India, and again, this was way back in the year after Kay passed, was with Achyut Partwardhan. Now, I'm sure that many of you are familiar who Achyut was and his role, his partnership with Gandhi, his very close relationship with Kay over the years. And one of the most important stories that Achyut told was of a Jain monk who came to visit with Kay, and he was really quite desperate. He had been a Jain monk for 14 years, and he felt like he was ready to commit suicide. Actually, the Jain monk was ready to commit suicide because he didn't feel like after 14 years he had changed. He had not fundamentally changed in the way that Kay is suggesting. So Kay said, well, sit down, relax. And he pointed out that the very process of, again, trying to chase the flowering of goodness or trying to become, implies, the a particular frame of mind that can't be done, right? You're asking the cognitive brain to do something that it cannot do, simply cannot be done. And the Jain monk listened, and I have to say, with this story, that Kay, his presence was palpable. There was something about his presence that radiated, the silent mind that he lived with, and being with him helped others kind of get a feeling or touch, a sense of what that silence is. And I think with the Jain monk that this was a very active thing. So being with Kay helping him and mentoring him to see that chasing flowering of goodness or chasing the Jain monk tradition, was like a dog chasing his tail, and he never kind of got the point, or he never went beyond the chasing of the tail and actually experienced directly what it was all about. But he did in Kay's presence, and he became silent, and tears filled his eyes, and he thanked him, and he was going to leave. He said, "Thank you very much. I just experienced silence in a way that I've never done before. I got it, and I'll be going now. Thank you very." He said, and Kay was nice. He said, "No, sit down, have some tea. Don't be in a rush." Um, and so then the Jain monk said, "I do have another question." He said, "That was very nice. I understand perfectly. I've experienced it directly. How do I get it back?" Kay laughed and said, "Well, I knew that's what you're going to ask. Obviously, who is it? What part of your mind is trying to get it back? Was it the mind that was silent that's trying to get it back? Or did you go back to the old mind?" And he said, "You went back to the old mind. And you're asking and the old mind is trying to get what it can't get. And there you are back with the dog chasing his tail again." And the point of that whole story, that Achut told that whole story out of his whole life's experiences with Kay, for a great reason, because he said, "I understand, sir. Won't come and trouble you again." That was the ending of Achut's story. "I won't come trouble you again." He got it beyond the dog chasing his tail. And I'm going to suggest that we don't get it that way. There's two ways. There's more than the quality of attention that Kay is expecting is for us to listen to his metaphors and actually use the metaphors that he's using. And all of his words are metaphors. So he's using metaphors to paint pictures. And what we do is we look at the picture that the metaphor creates in our brain. And what he's asking us to do is look through the metaphor and see what he's pointing out. If I use a window as a metaphor for the metaphor, we look at the window pane. We look at the window. We're not looking through the window. And that's a different quality of attention, a different quality of looking, is to look through the window, see and experience for ourselves what's being described, instead of reading a menu, right? We're like reading the menu and turning the pages and looking at what we want for lunch. That's looking at the window or looking at the metaphor. What you really want to do is you want to eat the lunch. We don't eat the lunch. We keep turning the pages, looking at the menu. And that, we think, is studying the teachings. And I think it's shallow. I don't think that that's what he had in mind. He wanted us to look through the metaphor, have an insight, and go about our life living the teachings. That was his intention. And it's not his fault, it's our fault. It's something about the way that we're listening and how we're looking and how we're relating to metaphor that prevents us from having the insight instead of just studying the metaphor. So I think that's endemic with Kay's material, with his presentation, et cetera, and it's a big challenge, I think. So in along with that same train of thought, the Zen Buddhists have a saying which I think is charming, and it is, if you see Buddha, kill him. And I'm paraphrasing that, saying, if we see Krishnamurti, kill him, right? Because to see Krishnamurti or to see the Buddha means we're chasing the image that our brain is conjuring up. We're not actually seeing what's really there. We're not going through the metaphor. We're stuck with the metaphor. And I hope you follow what I'm trying to share, that there's another way of looking. You look through the metaphor and have the insight instead of being stuck and seeing Buddha, or you're stuck seeing K. And I think he would appreciate that completely. He would always say, "Look, I'm not your teacher. I'm not your guru." He would say that with every single talk. You're looking at yourself. So he gave us hints in every talk, in every way, reframing this so that we are looking at what we're doing in our own brain, in our own sense of consciousness. That's the object that he was so passionate about. We're not listening to him. He would say, "I'm just a telephone. I'm just a messenger. I'm just holding up a mirror for you to look at yourself." So if you see Krishnamurti, kill him, I'm going to advocate. So that we can talk about that a little more. Each of these different ways of looking at this challenge, I think, is something that I would like to open to discussion. So make your notes and we can come back and explore each of these areas a little more. Um, and in and I brought up the AI issue because it's such a vital and important subject for humanity to deal with. Um, and I think that something similar is going on with AI, as I just described, is going on with most people's relationship to the so-called teachings, in that basically AI is nothing different than what Kay would say thought is. AI is just a mechanized version of the cognitive process that he called thought. Now, but it's much faster, it's much louder, it's much more complicated. It is so fast. It's been noted that they reached a point where AI's ability to learn is doubling the normal exponential curve. So you've got an exponential curve exponentially, right? So it's a double exponential curve with how fast and rapid AI is growing and changing and being able to mimic the normal thought process we have. And this is what we're faced with. So that if Kay was suggesting that thought was limited, then the exponential increase in AI is exponentially limited. The limitations implicit in thought are now just getting bigger. They're not fundamentally different than what Kay was talking about with thought. It's as if we just took the slice of the thought and we blew it up so that now it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So the challenge of actually experiencing what Kay was advocating, which is to put thought in its proper place and have a different ground of perception. And this is an insight that has come up many times looking at Kay's work. There was a book called The Only Revolution. You may be familiar with the book that was his notebook. And there were a few places throughout his legacy where he actually described his own inner experience. what it meant to see the river and how he looked at the tree and the river and the people and the so on and how he experienced his reality. He lived in this choiceless awareness. Thought was not active or operative most of his life. He used thought to meet the challenge, solve a problem, communicate. He used it as a tool, like a screwdriver. He needed a screwdriver to talk, so he would talk. But when he didn't need to talk, when he didn't need the screwdriver, he put it away, and it didn't keep going mechanically. Now, for us, we don't have a state, an authentic original state that's free from the mechanical repetition of thought's habits. I use a pinball machine as a metaphor for what thought does. The ball goes and it hits things and it goes bling, and then it bounces off of something else and goes bling, and we just chase the ball going bling 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 in our head, and we call that thinking. But Kay and Bohm both went at it quite deeply. This is just a mechanical reflexive process. So what we call thinking is a reflex. It's not really the kind of living insight that he was advocating was what we were how we were supposed to use thought. So a misuse of memory, a misuse of thought was Alan Anderson's summary of Kay's legacy. We grew this capacity to imagine things, to remember, extended memory and imagination, the ability to make up mental images that aren't present to the senses. So that's imagination and that's memory, and it bling, bling, blings reflexively, and we call that thinking. And both Bohm and Kay and others recognize that's a mechanical process, and real intelligence is another whole way of being. That is not intelligence. Mechanical pinball machine in your brain is not intelligence, which was their point. So the exponential growth of AI is simply going to push that ball, and we're going to be staring at our phones and staring at our screens, and technology is going to take over and fill our brains with artificial forms of thought, which are really fundamentally no different than what our mechanical thoughts are. And Krishnamurti's invitation will be diminished. It will grow invisible. It will become non-existent, because the noise created by our own thoughts and mechanical machine thoughts will overrun. And epigenetically, what Kay calls a silent mind will disappear. So that's my proposal, is that technology is going to render what Kay's been pointing to and inviting fundamentally invisible. We will lose the capacity to experience what he's talking about. This is basically epigenetic, meaning the brain is going to adapt to the environment, and the environment will have nothing to do with nature, and it will have nothing to do with what he called silence, and it will have nothing to do with what he called insight or intelligence. So those aspects are going to be erased from human potential by the noise created by artificial intelligence and machines. That's my proposal. A similar theme is similar to the Jain monk. All of the metaphors, all of what Kay was talking about, none of the words can actually grasp or hold or represent the experience that is being pointed out or invited. Kay would say it simply: the description is not the described. He said that until he was blue in the face. But we chase the description, and we don't have the experience of what is being described, because we're busy chasing we're busy chasing the concept. So fundamentally, you can't experience what Kay is talking about using your cognitive tools. Those tools have to be set aside in order to actually grasp what the tools are inviting us to grasp. So this is a paradox. This is a big challenge. Because again, we go back, we watch another tape, we say, oh, that's really great. I wish I could be this, and so on and so forth. So recognizing the paradox, if you see Buddha kill him, if you see K kill him, these are all different ways to point at the same challenge that we face. How do we use the tool called the teachings as a scalpel or as a hammer, and then put it away and live the experience that tool opened up for us, right? We have to put the teachings away to live the teachings. That's another simple way of saying it. But we go back and we study the teachings some more. One of the great exemplars of this paradox, her name was Doris Pratt. She's my poster child for this challenge that I'm bringing. Now, Doris was the secretary of the Order of the Star in the East when Kay gave his Truth is a Pathless Land talk. So back in 29, she was there. And we did an interview with Doris again in the year after Kay passed, 1987, in Brockwood. And she said in her interview, I'm quite certain that I'm Kay's greatest failure. I've studied him night and day for all these years, and I don't feel I'm transformed. I don't think I haven't transformed. He said if you give your heart and soul to this, that you'll be transformed. And she said that didn't happen to me. Now, this is kind of similar to what the Jain monk was talking about. And again, and at any rate, so she requested an interview with Kay when he was traveling back to California, knowing that she would probably never see him again. And she said, "Sir, I want to lay myself out for you. I want you to show me who I really am, etc." And Kay reacted sharply. He kind of stood up and he said, "Miss Pratt, you're like all the others. You come to me with a begging bowl. Nobody can do this for you. You have to do it for yourself." And he left. He walked. Don't turn to any authority to do what you have to do yourself. Right. So Doris is the greatest example of this challenge that we all have. I'm sharing this with you because you're a serious group. You've been at this for a long time. So why do we keep coming back? Why do we keep studying it? What's the proper use of the teachings? Are we using the teachings in the correct way so that we get it, we have lunch, and we go on instead of continuing to read the menu over and over again? So the final statement that I want to bring in this whole rant is, has Krishnaji's teachings become just another tradition? So truth is a pathless land. You can't approach it by any path whatsoever. That's enough of me. This is again, these are tough challenges. The final one might be, what does it mean to live the teachings? That's another way of getting at this same theme. What does it mean to actually live what he proposed, what he invited? 250,000 pages describing a different way of living, a different identity, a different way of relating to the world. Has K just become another tradition? Okay, your turn.
Thank you so much, Michael. A fascinating overview, and just the right launching pad to again invite friends to you can just unmute and think about what you want to say. So over to friends.
So, Stuart, good day, sir.
Good day, Michael. A simple question based on several things that you brought up. One refers to what Krishnamurti has written as the teachings. But isn't this very way of referring to the material, calling them the teachings, doesn't that somehow create in the mind something that is not immediate. I think if I were to, my sense of the way in which Krishnamurti presented whatever was going on was with a deep sense of immediacy. But when one thinks of teachings, one thinks of, was it 250,000 pages? It's a large volume that exists in space and time. So isn't this very notion itself a bit of a red herring,
I would
a
agree.
slight
I would agree
misunderstanding?
totally. No, I would agree totally. Now, Kay himself didn't come up with the phrase "the teachings." They, meaning the foundations and so on and so forth, they kind of got together and, what are we going to call this body of work? And they called it the teachings. And, again, another story with Achut. There was a group, Pupal Jayakar and Achut and Sunanda and another number of other people were very close to Kay in India. And at one of their meetings, he said, "Sir," somebody asked him a question, said, "Sir, your teachings," and he stood up again rather sharply and said, "There are no teachings." So Kay himself did not reference what he was doing as a teaching, right? What he was doing was that he was holding up, he would also say, "Do it now, sir." He said, "Do it now. Don't take notes," right? What are notes? Notes are the intellect trying to grasp the concept, and you're back into this dog chasing its tail kind of thing. So that wasn't his intention. His intention was for us to see something that he was pointing out in ourselves in the moment, and to have, again, what he called was an insight into what he was inviting us to see. But we translate that intention back into the intellect, into a concept. We write it down, we take notes. What we're doing is not looking through the metaphor, we're getting stuck in the metaphor. So we're getting stuck in the metaphor. He wanted us to look through the metaphor and have an insight and be done with it. So yes, I think that the teachings was just another is just another iteration of this general confusion.
Two of the most well-known metaphors would be, have you ever looked at a tree? And the observer is the observed. But I think what many of us, myself included, have done is to try to understand that somehow literally, or just even to try to understand it in any way. But I think, well, just taking those two examples, they kind of illustrate maybe something about the totality of his teachings in the way that you described, not to get stuck with the metaphor, but to look through. Using those two metaphors, or one of them, as an example of how one could not get stuck in the metaphor. Because they're kind of,
gosh, it's so tricky, right? Because we are, another common phrase that Kay used, which we don't understand, I think, is the content of consciousness is consciousness. Now, that's another tricky one, right? The content of consciousness is consciousness. What I think he was saying with that is that what we think consciousness is the collective metaphors that we keep running, right? Our experience of consciousness is the metaphor. Now, his experience was not the metaphor. He actually lived this choiceless awareness, or the silent mind, in which the cognitive process called metaphor was not active. There was no metaphor on. So there's nothing to get stuck in. In the state of choiceless awareness, there's no metaphor. There's no thought. You're silent. So that mechanism, and he would also often say, go to the root of it, go to the source of it. Don't try to dissect each metaphor, but understand the role, understand how metaphor operates as a structure, as a mechanical function in the brain. Have an insight into that. So choiceless awareness or silence or emptiness means there's no metaphor on. That switch is off. And very few of us actually experience that directly because it's always on. We only think we're conscious when we got metaphors. But obviously there was a prenatal state and an early childhood state before your brain was filled with metaphors. So there is an authentic original state, which Kay calls silence, where language and metaphor is not operative. But we are so deeply conditioned to learn language, which means to engage in metaphor, so that we deeply condition the brain to only respond to metaphor. So metaphor is our default state. We call it thought. Thought is our default state. When you wake up, you have a thought, right? So thought's active, you wake up and thought's going all the time. Now you may have physical sensations, you may see the wind or feel something or swim and all that kind of stuff, but thought is the dominant. That's our default state is thought. His default state was not thought. He used thought as a tool when it was necessary, and then it stopped. And we have not cultivated the capacity to do that, so that we use thought as a tool that is put away. And then this other state, which is entangled empathic intelligence, right? That becomes our reality state. That's our default, is entangled empathic intelligence. Not thought and metaphor, but something much bigger. And also what happens is that when you actually experience emptiness or the absence of the conceptual, your identity changes, because our identity is in the thought realm. What we call ego, who we think we are, whether we're a good boy or a good girl, whether we're an A student or a failure, whether a success as a father or a dope, what all those social roles, those are all metaphors. They're all part of the dog chasing its tail state. So when in choiceless awareness, that ego state and all of the social conditioning that we have disappears, then what are we? Who are we then? Buddhists call it interdependence. So we are entangled in everything. We're not me separate. We're not the observer separate, but there's this swirling creative process. Creation is going on. We're not a separate ego, me against you, Republican, Democrat, Buddhist, Christian, blah, 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 blah. All of those things go away. So our fundamental identity changes when we experience the default state that Kay is inviting. That whole ego structure is not operative.
I would like to put this question to my friend Michael. In regard to AI, I find that it seems that the more AI develops, the more seductive and addictive it becomes. Can we be aware of this ongoing enchantment with AI? And the second part is that, is it possible for our conditioned mind to find the right place for artificial intelligence?
So the short answer to this is we can go back to the influence of television in the 1950s as an example, right? We can take just a look at how addictive we are to our telephones. You go to the restaurant now and people aren't talking to each other. They're talking to their phones or pointing. All the kids are looking at their phones, right? So this is epigenetic, as when you change the environment, you change the way that the brain functions. You change its perceptual reference points. So my point is that AI, just like TV, is a force that fundamentally changes what we call reality, what we experience as reality. And there are certain perceptual thresholds, every sense of the pressure and the temperature and taste and all of these sensory um, sensitivities have thresholds. And when you increase the intensity of a particular experience, the threshold of that experience closes, narrows. So it's a way that the brain can continue. We'd be overwhelmed if all of the sensations that we're experiencing got experienced as we were conscious of all the sensations as we're moving through the day. We become conscious of. So the brain naturally clips or truncates the amount of sensory data that makes it into consciousness, right? So what's happening is that as the environment gets more stimulating, the thresholds of perception close. Now they did some research on this after World War II, and this was the Max Planck Institute in Germany, and they did sensory acuity tests. How many colors of red do you see? How many nuances of red do you see? What sounds do you actually, when do you actually hear a sound and when does it disappear? So there are soft sounds and loud sounds. And what they found was that as the world got more stimulating after World War II compared to before, I mean, just think about before automobiles, right? Think about how quiet the world was before automobiles. So you introduce automobiles, suddenly the world becomes so noisy and the brain closes down and only lets the noise of the car through. You don't hear any of the sounds that are not that have been closed off. So with all of the senses, as the world becomes more stimulating, as the visual and digital world is doing, that means that the brain is closing off your conscious awareness of all the other colors besides the digital, or I'm using that as an example with AI. Um, anyway, we could look at a lot of, I hope I'm making sense. So this is not just a theory. I know for a fact that these thresholds, perceptual thresholds exist. They're narrowing as the volume goes up. What we call reality diminishes. The shades are excluded. They're no longer registered in consciousness. So Kay kept talking about being sensitive. The silent mind is a sensitive mind, which means that the thresholds of perception are expanding. You're becoming more aware of the nuance and the subtleties, right? But the chattering mind, the talking mind in a digital world where we're, bombarded with all of this noise, means that the doors of perception are being narrowed. And as AI continues to expand and be thrown at us through all of the mechanical devices, the silent mind becomes invisible. It no longer exists in the way that Kay is inviting. That's my epigenetic reference point and concern. It's not about AI taking over the world or beating people at chess or any of that kind of stuff. It will continue to grow exponentially. And it's mechanical now. It's already past those thresholds. The cat is out of the bag, and whether it turns into a dinosaur or a friend, we have yet to find out. But epigenetically, I know that what I'm talking about has great merit. So in order to really address your question even more specifically, we're not even able to manage our own conditioning without AI mechanical conditioning, right? Kay's basic thesis was not dealing with AI, it was just dealing with normal conditioning. And we haven't been able to be grounded in the silent mind, in the intelligent mind, because the mechanical nature of our thought process is taking over and pushes the silence off the stage. So I think the same thing. I think that's so I don't think we've done a good job. And frankly, without addressing what Kay was talking about as human beings, without being grounded in what he calls a silent mind and using thought and technology coherently without its self-deceptions and all of its screwy things that it does, to throw AI on top of it is crazy. First things first. I feel a little embarrassed speaking so firmly about all of this because I'm just like you. I'm not a saint. I don't have a silent mind all the time, et cetera, et cetera. I wake up thinking, right? I have as many problems as you do. But I do know, like the Jain monk, I do have an embodied experience of what Kay called silence. So and this happened in the Rishi Valley when he was there, just like the Jain monk. I got it, sir. This was an amazing thing. I know what you're talking about. Everything made sense after I had the experience of what silence really was like. Everything he said just fit perfectly, right? So I have a reference in my own experience of this difference between what he means is silence. Um, he made it simply. He said all you have to do is just pay complete attention. With complete attention, there's no observer, he said. It's no more difficult than that. Then he would say, just like the Jain monk, you know, even if it's just for a second, he said that's good enough. Don't try to get it more. Don't try to have more because then you're already stuck. You're already back in the dog chasing its tail, wanting to have more, right? So, he's actually so simple, so really very simple. But we're stuck in the metaphor and we don't look through it and experience what he's really describing in ourselves and finished.
Michael, I just have two
Yes,
questions.
sir.
Two questions. One is actually, we received that lovely book of yours, Unconditionally Free, a couple of years back, and then we've been looking at it. So it's huge, it's a beautifully produced book. But what struck me was the title, Unconditionally Free. Do tell us about what drove that description of the book, Unconditionally Free. What was that all about? Because it was so beautiful. I think the production is unique, absolutely unique.
It's a great question and it has a wonderful history. To the best of my knowledge, he only used unconditionally free once, which is in the 1929 Dissolving the Order of the Star presentation. That was his goal, was to set man unconditionally free. Well, basically, he's throwing in the word conditioning, unconditionally. He wants us to be free of our mechanical conditioning, period. Well, our mechanical conditioning happens reflexively. It's a reflex. It's not, it's monkey. It's just basically a habit, right? So in order to go beyond the habit, one needs to bring attention. And we are normally operating at a fairly low level of attention. We don't give complete attention. We're kind of in a semi-daydreaming state. We walk through the world thinking and talking to ourselves, listening to the radio, staring at the phone. This is not what he means by complete attention. This is ADHD at its max, right? So most of the population is totally distracted with daydreams and talking to themselves and so on and so forth. From Kay's perspective, we're all nuts. we're literally nuts. We're like the madman in the asylum talking to ourselves. Staring at the phone is no different, right? So, so first of all, that's the context for unconditionally free was from that talk. Now, years ago, 2008, not maybe even before, I forget it, in the early 2000s, Evelyn Blau, my colleague, went to an exhibit for Freud, and in Los Angeles, they had Freud's couch and his notebook, and they just did this wonderful museum exhibit on the life of Freud. And she came back and she was very excited, and she called me and she said, Michael, I just saw this thing on Freud, and we should do something like that on Kay. Deserves a traveling exhibit so it can go to museums and universities and travel around. So in the book, you see the timeline. We use a timeline, and we actually had a late 1850s to the turn of the century in Kay's birth as a block, and then we went decade by decade or year by year throughout his whole life, and we took the what was going in the culture above the line and what was going on in Kay's life beneath the timeline. So you had this juxtaposition of world events and what was going on in his life. So we used the timeline, and Evelyn always, we did this big, looked like Stonehenge. It was a big traveling exhibit with like 8 foot panels high, and they were 3.5 feet wide. And the timeline went around this circle. So you would walk the circle of his life and see photographs of what was going on. And Evelyn always wanted to do a miniature so that people could have the timeline at home, and it didn't scale well. You couldn't read the type. It was to get it down to something that was usable by an individual. It was too small, so I resisted it. But we did achieve it in the book. We used the same design for that exhibit for his decade by decade review of his life. So we accomplished her goal for the timeline in the book form. So basically, the book parallels that timeline, and we have highlights from all of his talks, from his earliest talks, decade by sequence. So it's sequential. So each year there was a different place. One was in Amsterdam, one was in Berlin, one was in Rio or whatever it was, you know. So you go around the world with his talks, and you see the essence of his talks in how his language changed, et cetera, et cetera. Then part two of the book was more or less my inspiration. When you have a map, I'm looking at the metaphor as being a map, and you need a key. You need a legend. You need to know that 1 inch equals a mile and so on and so forth, right? In order to really look at the map that the book represents. So the second part of the book was my attempt to give the reader some context of how to approach the teachings. And what we're talking about is part of that, right? I'm saying that if we're just going to read and study and be lost in the metaphors, that you need a legend, you need some way of realizing that there's another way to relate to the material. And that's part of what I'm focusing on with our presentation tonight, is that there's another way of relating to what this body of work, Kay's legacy, to look through the metaphor and not get lost in the metaphor. So this should be hopeful, right? You all look kind of bewildered, right? So what I'm trying to do is liberate you from being like Doris Pratt. So at the end of your life, you said, well, I studied Krishnamurti my whole life and it didn't work, right? So we don't want that, right? We want what he wanted, right? We want you to get it and live it, right?
My question is related to the technology part of which you spoke about earlier. So, as you said that we are surrounded by thought in technological form, whether it's on the phone, whether it's on the TV, and we are constantly being bombarded with thoughts. of others, and we tend to get absorbed in it. And the algorithms are also designed in such a way that it encourages choice. You keep scrolling like one choice after the other, you keep clicking. Living in this technological world, can one be choicelessly aware when always, they are triggering choices, they want us to choose constantly?
Well, if I understand your question, I think you're making a proposal that the conditioning that media represents, number one, grabs our attention, right? So the content of consciousness is consciousness. So if we're giving our attention to media, then the media is the content of our consciousness, and that's filling us up. We don't have any consciousness other than that, right? It fills us up. The cup is full. And when we add AI to it and the growing technology, the cup is overflowing, is my point, right? We have a cup, but they're pouring a pitcher into the cup. So there's no room left for what we call choiceless awareness. That's my proposal. And I don't see any way around it. I don't think I don't know. I think this, again, metaphor of we have a cup, it's called our brain, and it has a certain capacity for attention. And AI and technology, even today, is overflowing our cup. Our cup is overflowing. We don't have any attention left over. And it's only in that leftover silence where real intelligence lies, and all of the other kinds of things that Dave Bowman, so on and so forth, talked about. How do we access our innate intelligence, which was what Kay was again inviting, right? He wanted us to meet the world spontaneously with our innate intelligence. We have this billions of years of conditioning, or excuse me, of evolution going on, and we're stuck in nationalism, right? So look what's going on in Gaza. Look what's going on everywhere, right? Politically accepted. All of the horrors that Kay always talked about are still here. Right? So things have not changed a bit. They've just gotten more complicated. And technology is partially responsible for driving this complexity.
So you think it's impossible to live in the world of technology without being caught in it?
The content of our consciousness, Kay said we're secondhand human beings. That was his way of talking about how our collective propaganda is filling us up and we're identifying with it. So we didn't choose all the propaganda. We didn't choose the identity that we grew up with, right? This was all this was in the environment. The environment imprinted all the propaganda and all the identity, and I'm a Hindu and you're a Christian and blah, 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 blah. We didn't choose all that. This was all mechanically imprinted just because we were swimming in it. And this was what our attachment to language and imagery and imagination and blah, 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 blah. So no, we are epigenetically determined. The environment changes how the brain represents reality. When you change the environment, you change reality. That's basically what epigenetics is. And I don't know of anybody else who's really looking at AI with this epigenetic view. I have a friend and a mentor. His name was Joseph Chilton Pierce, and Joe was quite adamant about this epigenetic effect. He studied it his whole life. How the nature of consciousness and our whole reality structure is epigenetically determined. So that's just me. It's just me. Like I said, I don't know anybody else who's really looking at AI with the epigenetic, with this framework, but there's not many other people who have spent 50 years working with Kay's material and are looking at AI with that reference. So I'm kind of lucky in a way. So I did a program for the KFA on AI, the same theme, but I went into this epigenetic effect rather carefully. As mentioned, I have a website. It's called Touch the Future, TT and the word future.org, ttfuture.org. And at the bottom of the page, on the home page, is a link for Krishnamurti. And many of the programs that we've been developing are posted there. It's the only place where these are actually, not even publicly available. Nobody's really, they're not on YouTube or any other format. This is just because there happened to be my work that I host them there. And at the bottom of the page is a link to the presentation that I did for the KFA on AI. And I think it's great. It gives a long history. It goes into this epigenetic perspective quite well. And, I would encourage you to take a look at that. In the context of Krishnamurti's insights, I'm Michael Mendizza. This presentation describes how technology is impacting human consciousness in ways that obscure Krishnamurti's core vision. You can write me if you have questions about it. I'm happy to relate or answer any questions that I can. I'm pretty available.
Sir, I am also a fellow documentary maker. The little understanding that I have of J. Krishnamurti when he talks about the word actuality, and I feel actuality is if we see it in terms of the time factor, I believe actuality is our daily life. And so our daily life is also, in a way, a documentary. But I am not very sure about this, so I wanted to ask you.
If I understand you correct, Kay used the phrase, what is, for actuality, to actually see what is.
Yeah.
Now, in order to see what is, you can't be looking through your conditioning. You can't be looking through your identity. You can't be looking through being a Muslim or a Protestant or a Democrat or whatever it is. Even a guy, male and female, all of these are social images. So you've got the image making, and this goes into image making. So what we call consciousness is basically a composite of the image making, imaginative image making capacity, which is the foundation for language and metaphor. Imagination, the ability to create mental images not present to the senses, dreams, thoughts. These are all imaginative constructs. So to see what is, you can't have your image making lenses, you can't have your personal virtual reality image making lenses on so that you're trying to look at the world through the image. And Kay was talking about, he said very clearly, and I happen to be sensitive to the image making metaphor because I'm a filmmaker and photographer, so I spent my life making images. So I was quite keen on when he would talk about image making. So, and he would say the structure of it. So what is imagination? How does imagination contribute to what we call reality? Now, if you are identified as a Buddhist or a Muslim or a CEO or a policeman, right? If you're identified with any of those images, you are not seeing what is. You're seeing the image. Right. And like I said, he said, so most of our relationships with other people are based on the images that we have of ourselves and others. So in the Buddhist tradition, they basically say that that image making is a relative reality or is, what's the word? Ignorance. Believing that the image is what is ignorance. It's a misunderstanding of how memory is working. Right. So, so I'm just saying that most, and the content of consciousness is consciousness. So for most of us, most of the time, we are not seeing what is. We're seeing the mental images that are conditioning, and we believe it. We believe our images, right? If we didn't believe our images, we wouldn't go to war and kill each other. So we believe that we're a Christian and we have to go to war with some. Anyway, we believe all this stuff. We believe the metaphor. And we don't see what is. And Kay was saying, how can you be sane and live as an authentic human being if you're crazy. Treating the metaphor as reality is crazy. I don't know whether I addressed your question or not, but that when you use the word authentic, I thought I would just try to unfold that word a little bit, and or actual. When you use the word actual, um, I'm assuming that you mean what Kay would say, what is, and then the image making process comes into play, and that's where the delusion is. That's where the misunderstanding is. So with complete attention, this is the key here. With complete attention, with a silent mind, with choiceless awareness, that image making stops. It's not active. It's not on. And Kay would use the example of seeing the Grand Canyon, or seeing the sunrise and the rainbow and the beautiful sky. And there's something about the moment with nature that was so breathtaking that you went in, you were silent. There was no conditioning going on, which was why you experienced this ecstatic state as you did. So he lived in that ecstatic state of sensitivity most of the time, except when he was talking, right? And he'd finish the talk and he would, you know, go out and be ecstatic again. I don't know whether I addressed your question as a filmmaker.
No,
So
you did. You did, Michael, because my mind is mostly hazy, and some parts of my mind need attention, and that attention I could get, and I could, things could fall into perspective.
So I'll tell you a personal story, and I don't know whether it will help or not, but it was my own experience. So when I was young, I had a pretty bad dyslexia, and dyslexia is a language issue. It's not an intelligence issue. It's how the brain processes symbols and metaphors, language and letters. Letters would float off the page. I would watch them spin around. It was, quite interesting, but it didn't help me spell. It didn't help me, while I was in the early schooling, be able to master all the language skills that one had to have. Now, the trauma of that became quite severe. I remember walking home from early childhood, elementary school, and so on in tears. Don't send me back there again. It was such a horrible thing. But they, pushed me back anyway. So um, years later, I'm, working with professionals. I'm conducting some workshops or participating in some panel discussions with, 300 psychologists and psychiatrists and some very professional people. And, I'm asked to mediate this event, right? So I'm supposed to be up there and talking to these people and so on. Well, um, that triggered all of those early childhood experiences of being humiliated because I publicly, messed up and couldn't spell and so on and so forth. And I discovered that if I looked at the triggers, if I looked at the trauma, meaning if I looked at the memory of it, I would get stuck. I would stutter, and I couldn't move forward. But then I realized that all I had to do is give my attention to what I was doing and not be distracted by the past. And I could just go for, I just give my present, I could just be present and move forward and address what I'm addressing. It was so simple. All you had to do is give attention to what you're doing instead of giving your attention over to your past traumas and your worries and what are they going to think about me and all that stuff. Right? So that became so simple, utterly simple. Don't worry about what your old memory. That's not really what's going on in the moment, except you're bringing it up. Redirect, just stop looking this way and don't look in the rear view mirror, just look forward. In a sports vernacular, just hit the ball. Don't worry about where it's going or whether you're going to win. Just hit the ball. It's so simple. That's complete attention. just hit the ball. Just be with your kid, right? Just be with whoever you're with at the moment without this past conditioning coming back and causing you to stutter and be stupid. Just hit the ball. Just give your attention to whatever it is. And that's all Kay was talking about. That's complete attention. But it takes waking up out of this rather dull norm that we carry about to do that. If you're dull and daydreaming, then the daydreaming takes over and runs itself. So you have to be awake enough to just hit the ball. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, Michael.
It's so stupidly simple. You just hit the ball.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's not like a big practice or anything. It's just you just keep hitting the ball. You're just driving the car. You're just, loving your kids or your wife. You're just being present. I love the word presence. I think presence is one of the simplest words for complete attention. If you're just be present, right? Literally. And if you're really present, if you really love, I'm fortunate. I'm an old guy, but I've got a 10-year-old daughter. So I've got my 10-year-old daughter that I need to be present with. So when she comes in and it's time to read or to be together, I stop what I'm doing. And I'm just with her. That's as simple as it is. Like I said, the daydream, you have to be able to not be totally enchanted by your daydreams in order to just be present, right? So there's a quality of energy and attention and presence that supersedes your past ghosts and worries and fears and so on and so forth.
Definitely, Michael, it has helped me, especially the sports vernacular that you used. That kind of made the picture very clear. I completely got it with that. Yeah.
I interviewed 30 LPGA and PGA tour players for a documentary that I did. And they talk about being in the zone, right? So what is the zone? So it's the state of flow. What is the state of flow? It's actually what kids call play, right? Play, the zone, and the flow are the same state, but just look like the blind man and the elephant. It's a wall, it's a this, right? So what is that state? Well, Csikszentmihalyi wrote a book called Flow, The Psychology of Optimum Experience. And in that book, he defined it. He just basically said, the challenge is so compelling that there's no leftover attention, complete attention. You're just hitting the ball. That's flow, right? You're not worried about how well you're doing or whether it's right or am I pretty, am I going to win the award? None of that's happening. So you're just hitting the ball. Now, J. Krishnamurti said, with complete attention, there's no observer. Same thing. Exactly the same thing in a different way.
Yeah.
A play researcher named Fred Donaldson said, when I play, Fred disappears. Right? What's Fred? It's those collection of old memories and all those labels and identities. And you no longer are being blinded by being a father or being a coach or being the teacher or being whatever that image is. And then your definition of who you are expands infinitely. When the ghosts disappear, your identity expands infinitely. And you have all the colors of the rainbow to come and be present with whatever the relationship is, with a pet, with a dog, with your wife, with your colleague, whatever it is. You can just simply be totally present. And then you have all the colors to bring to that relationship, which is, if you're trying to be the dad or the coach or the PhD, you're stuck into this little narrow definition, and all of those extra qualities disappear. They're cut off by the image. So it's so simple. And Kay said it was so simple, a 6-year-old can understand this, right? I mean, and he's right. He's totally correct.
just in case there are no questions immediately, but don't forget that we will keep this interaction going. Did not end today actually, because I'll be communicating with everybody. In case you don't have our email, if you could email us, very simple address, kfikolkata@gmail.com. Then we'll be in touch, because after this program I'll share with you a little bit about Michael's work, his website, etc. Because all the things he talked about, those programs, etc., everything is available there on that. So let's not end the association today. I hope we can build on it. To you, Michael, thank you so much for giving us time today. We're so happy, and I hope we can meet, and if we have the right opportunity to again interact sometime. And thanks to all our friends from far off places. Let's hope we can meet again soon, and we'll be in touch. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much.